Today, we discuss India's achievement of 20% ethanol blending in petrol, commonly referred to as E20. This milestone is particularly important because India has achieved it ahead of its original 2030 target, and from 1st April, E20 fuel has been rolled out nationwide. This is not merely a technical accomplishment related to fuel composition. Rather, it represents a major transformation in India's energy strategy, agricultural economy, environmental policy, and long-term quest for strategic autonomy. To fully understand the significance of this achievement, we must first place it within a broader context. India remains heavily dependent on imported crude oil for meeting its energy requirements. Global geopolitical instability, particularly in regions such as West Asia, repeatedly exposes the vulnerability of all importing countries like India. Every major fluctuation in crude oil prices directly affects inflation, transportation costs, trade deficits, and economic stability within the country. Therefore, reducing dependence on imported fossil fuels has long been a strategic priority for India. It is in this context that ethanol blending emerges as an important policy instrument. Interestingly, India's ethanol blending journey did not begin recently. It started as a pilot project in 2001 and was later institutionalized through the Ethanol Blended Petrol Program or EBP program in 2003. Over the years, through continuous policy support and expansion of production capacity, India has now become the world's third largest ethanol producer after the United States and Brazil. Now let us understand what exactly the Ethanol Blended Petrol Program seeks to achieve. The core objective of the program is to blend ethanol with petrol in order to reduce crude oil imports, strengthen energy security, lower vehicular emissions, support farmers and sugar mills, and promote India's transition toward renewable energy sources. Therefore, the program combines environmental, economic, agricultural, and strategic objectives simultaneously. Since 2014, the government has significantly accelerated ethanol production through several policy interventions. One major intervention was the introduction of administered pricing mechanisms which provided assured prices for ethanol producers. This reduced uncertainty and encouraged investment in ethanol production. The government also introduced interest subvention schemes to financially support distillery expansion and infrastructure development. Additionally, feedstock diversification became a major focus area. Initially, ethanol production depended heavily on C-heavy molasses. Gradually, the policy framework expanded to include B-heavy molasses, sugarcane juice, maj, and broken rice as feedstocks for ethanol production. These interventions substantially expanded India's domestic ethanol production capacity and created a more diversified supply base. Now, let us examine the major achievements associated with E20 blending. The first major achievement lies in strengthening India's clean energy transition. The successful nationwide rollout of E20 demonstrates policy continuity and effective institutional coordination in renewable fuel adoption. In a country as large and diverse as India, implementing such a large-scale fuel transition requires cooperation across ministries, oil marketing companies, automobile manufacturers, distilleries, agricultural stakeholders, and state governments. This achievement also aligns with India's larger climate commitments, including its net-zero aspirations and green mobility goals. Ethanol blending represents an important component of India's broader strategy to transition toward cleaner energy systems. The second major achievement concerns environmental benefits. Ethanol blending reduces harmful vehicular emissions, such as carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons. Consequently, it contributes to cleaner urban air and helps reduce the carbon footprint associated with transportation. Considering the severe air pollution challenges faced by many Indian cities, even partial reductions in vehicular emissions carry substantial public health significance. The third major achievement relates to economic gains for farmers and sugar mills. The ethanol economy has created an important alternative source of revenue for both farmers and distilleries, especially in major sugarcane producing states such as Uttar Pradesh, Maharashtra, and Karnataka. The financial impact has been substantial. Between 2014 and 2024, sugar mills earned more than 94,000 crore rupees through ethanol sales. Additionally, around 98.3% of cane dues were cleared during the 2022-23 sugar season. This is highly significant because delayed payments to sugarcane farmers have historically been a major problem in India's agricultural economy. Improved liquidity in the sugar sector has therefore reduced farmer distress and strengthened rural incomes. Another important achievement is the partial reduction in oil dependence. Between 2014 and 2024, the Ethanol Blended Petrol Program substituted nearly 193 lakh metric tons of crude oil. Approximately 4.5 crore barrels of crude oil imports were avoided during this period. However, while this reduction is important, we must also understand its limitations. Despite achieving E20 blending, the reduction in India's total import bill remained below 3%. Why did this happen? The primary reason is that overall fuel demand in India continues to rise rapidly due to expanding transportation networks, increasing vehicle ownership, urbanization, and economic growth. Therefore, even though ethanol blending reduces dependence to some extent, the overall energy demand continues to grow simultaneously. Now, after achieving E20 policy discussions are increasingly shifting toward the possibility of E30 blending. But this transition raises several important questions and challenges. To understand the scale of the challenge, we must look at the numbers. India produced around 985 crore liters of ethanol in 2025. E20 blending itself required approximately 1,016 crore liters. However, achieving E30 by 2030 may require nearly 1,700 to 1,800 crore liters of ethanol. This would demand a massive expansion in production capacity, feedstock availability, storage infrastructure, and transportation systems. This brings us to the critical challenges associated with higher ethanol blending. One of the biggest concerns is water stress and environmental sustainability. A major criticism of ethanol expansion is the heavy dependence on water-intensive crops such as sugarcane and rice. For example, producing 1 liter of sugarcane-based ethanol requires nearly 2,860 liters of water. Rice-based ethanol can require even more water. The implications are serious. Expansion of ethanol production based on such crops intensifies groundwater depletion, ecological stress, and unsustainable cropping patterns, particularly in water-stressed states such as Uttar Pradesh, Maharashtra, and Karnataka. Even though MAJ is relatively less water-intensive, large-scale diversion of MAJ toward ethanol production may alter agricultural priorities and land use patterns. Therefore, the challenge is not simply about increasing ethanol production, but about ensuring that production remains ecologically sustainable. Another important concern relates to food security. India increasingly uses surplus food grains, such as broken rice and excess sugar stocks for ethanol production. While this may appear efficient under surplus conditions, the situation becomes risky during years of lower agricultural production. For instance, in 2023, lower production of sugarcane and rice forced the government to restrict diversion of these feedstocks toward distilleries. India's agricultural system remains highly dependent on monsoon conditions, and events such as El Niño can significantly reduce paddy production. In such scenarios, excessive diversion of food grains toward fuel production may threaten food availability, increase prices, and affect nutritional security. Therefore, policymakers must carefully balance energy security objectives with food security priorities. The next challenge concerns infrastructure and investment constraints. Moving from E20 to E30 would require substantial expansion of molasses-based distilleries, grain-based distilleries, ethanol storage systems, transportation infrastructure, and logistics networks. These are highly capital-intensive investments requiring long-term planning, financial support, and strong policy coordination. Without adequate infrastructure, higher blending targets may become difficult to sustain operationally. Another major issue relates to automotive compatibility. Since 2023, newly sold vehicles in India have been designed to be E20 compliant. However, a very large number of existing vehicles are still not fully compatible even with E20 fuel. If India moves toward E30, the challenges become even greater. Higher ethanol blending levels would require engine modifications, improved fuel systems, and widespread adoption of flex-fuel vehicles. Without such adjustments, consumers may experience reduced fuel efficiency, increased maintenance costs, and greater engine wear. This could ultimately reduce public acceptance of higher ethanol blending. Despite these limitations, ethanol blending remains strategically important for India. It diversifies India's energy basket and strengthens domestic fuel production. It reduces vulnerability to global oil shocks and contributes toward rural income generation. It also advances India's climate goals by supporting cleaner fuel systems. Most importantly, in a world increasingly shaped by geopolitical uncertainty and volatile energy markets, domestic biofuel production enhances India's strategic autonomy. A country that depends excessively on imported energy remains vulnerable to external disruptions. Therefore, even partial diversification through ethanol strengthens national resilience. Now let us discuss the way forward. The first requirement is shifting toward less water-intensive feedstocks. India cannot indefinitely rely on sugarcane and rice for ethanol production. Policy should gradually encourage alternatives such as MAJ, agricultural residues, and non-food biomass. This naturally leads us to the importance of second generation or 2G ethanol. Perhaps the most sustainable long-term solution lies in scaling up to G ethanol production, which uses crop residues, agricultural waste, and non-food biomass instead of food crops. This approach carries multiple advantages simultaneously. It reduces stubble burning, lowers pressure on food security, requires less water, improves waste management, and enhances environmental sustainability. Therefore, 2G ethanol represents not merely an energy solution, but also an environmental and agricultural reform strategy. The government must also design regional and plant-specific incentives. Ethanol production should be encouraged in water-abundant regions and ethanol-deficient states to avoid ecological imbalance. A uniform national approach may not work effectively because India's ecological conditions vary significantly across regions. Another critical area is strengthening the flex-fuel vehicle ecosystem. India must accelerate the manufacturing of flex-fuel vehicles, standardize engine technologies, improve fuel infrastructure, and increase consumer awareness regarding ethanol-compatible vehicles. At the same time, India may strategically explore ethanol imports during periods of domestic shortage. Countries such as Brazil possess advanced ethanol industries and can complement India's supply when necessary. Trade negotiations with countries like the United States may also include ethanol-related imports and technology cooperation. As we conclude, we must recognize that India's achievement of E20 blending is undoubtedly a landmark success in the country's clean energy transition. It demonstrates policy commitment, institutional coordination, and strategic foresight. However, the future path, particularly the transition toward higher blending levels, such as E30, cannot rely solely on aggressive production expansion. The challenge now is to ensure that ethanol growth remains scientifically planned, environmentally sustainable, economically viable, and regionally balanced. Therefore, India requires a calibrated, evidence-based, and ecologically sensitive strategy. The ultimate objective should not simply be producing more ethanol, but building a resilient and sustainable biofuel ecosystem that supports energy security without undermining food security, water sustainability, or environmental balance. In the coming decades, the success of India's ethanol policy will depend not merely on blending percentages, but on whether the country can harmonize energy transition with ecological sustainability and long-term developmental priorities.